All right then. So are we live? I assume we are. Right. So welcome everyone to our presentation today on DORA. And I hope you enjoy the presentation and the material that we have to cover for today. Right. So let us start by briefly touching on the agenda for today and what we're going to be actually covering for today. So we will start with a bit of introduction as to who are the presenters, why we are here, what our purpose, and why we are talking about DORA. We will then talk a little bit about the actual premise and the aim of DORA, why it has been constructed and why it has been released, and why is it important. We'll cover the scope, who's in scope, and maybe touch base a little bit about the exclusions, talk about the general structure of the document in order to inform your perspective where you should place your efforts when you actually digest the regulation, because it is the breadth and the depth of the regulation is quite significant. We will talk about the new regulators that will be installed in member states and perhaps what powers they will hold in order to conduct their investigations. We'll talk also about, of course, non-compliance and what does it look like based on the contents of the regulation. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to actually get to the compliance from this point onwards. Okay, so introductions then. So Dale, would you like to introduce yourself first? So XM Cyber.
Sure thing, thanks. So hi everyone, great to be here. My name is Dale Fairbrother. I'm one of the product marketing managers here at XM Cyber. I do have a very technical background. I've got around 20 years experience in cybersecurity across the industry of all kinds of vendors, MSP partners, resellers, you name it. So I do know a few things about compliance and regulations across different industries. And from XM Cyber's point of view, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we're a leading provider of continuous exposure management. We're able to give you the attacker's perspective of your environment, but are able to translate that to a defender view and help you understand how to make your systems more resilient, how to remove weaknesses in your defenses, and give you the guidance to make your products, your environment safer to use and hopefully more aligned with particular compliance. And it's really great to be here with one of our sort of strategic partners across the UK, Adarma. So Edward, thank you very much for letting me attend today.
Awesome. I'm sure this is going to be just generally a very useful conversation because from the attacker's perspective and then the defender's perspective and how to actually put this together, especially with respect to one of the key pillars and how this pillar affects all the rest of the pillars within this set regulation. Right.
Definitely.
Well, my name is Edward. I work for a company called Adarma. I am one of the principal consultants here. I have about 15 years of experience in cybersecurity, and I specialize in cybersecurity for the financial sector. And the key areas for me are governance, risk, and compliance. Similar to Dale, I also have a technical background. I started my career in red team operations, where I have conducted work which would be related to reverse engineering and malware analysis. And I do hope that you find this conversation about DORA today useful. In terms of perhaps a little bit about Adarma as a business, we are a British company and our speciality is managed security operations and consultancy services. We provide consultancy services regarding the governance, risk, and compliance, and we also provide services with respect to security operations, platform management, and such. All right. So let's get then into DORA. So what is the key premise and the aim of DORA? It is really in the name, right? It's a Digital Operational Resilience Act. And this particular regulation is aimed specifically at the financial sector. In terms of the contents of the regulation in general, if you have ever seen any standard related to cybersecurity, you will already be well informed about the potential contents of the regulation. It's not going to cover necessarily anything new. However, it is important to understand the overall structure of the document, the scope as to who it applies to, who are the exclusions. And this is something that we're going to cover in the next slides.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's a really powerful new regulation coming out, but it's a bit unique and different to many other regulations and compliance standards out there. I find a lot of the regulations that have come out historically are very controlling. They're very forced, forcing you to set particular boundaries and potentially cause some friction to your users to sort of wrap them with security. This act is a little bit different. It's about making sure you can guarantee the safety and the delivery of your financial services. And this is kind of your goal. So it's the goal of the regulator to support you in that journey. So this, if you've read through, the content related to DORA, you'll see this is very sort of a positive viewpoint of how to support you to deliver the optimum level of services, which is all about that resiliency and keeping your systems safe from attack, but also safe in their operational state. So I do see this as quite a fundamental methodology to help you drive success across your financial organization.
Yeah, this is actually a very good point. And I think also something to be aware of. It really does aim to install that resilience from a systemic risk perspective, right? Because the financial services are interconnected. We utilize technology in order to deliver these services. And given the interconnectivity between effectively businesses that operate within the financial sector, resilience is key. If one of the big major banks, for instance, has been affected, the likelihood that smaller banks will be affected and the market is affected is quite high. And this is what this particular regulation actually tries to address. It's to install that additional bit of resilience into the ICT services.
And this is very much a European standard, as we've sort of mentioned here. So why should anyone in the UK be interested? Should they care about it, Edward? What's its relevance to the people on the call today?
I do believe this is the case. If you are performing any sort of activities, do any business with the European entities, financial entities, you should be most certainly aware of this. If not directly, indirectly, because ICT technology service providers and service providers related to technology are in scope of this particular regulation. What do you think, Dale?
Yeah, it sort of claims anyone that is delivering financial services to an EU member state or people within it. So, we've started talking about this quite heavily. We published some web content on this subject as well. And we are getting audiences and viewers from across the globe that are reading this and understanding they need to be part of it. So even organizations over in the United States that have a trading entity over here in the EU, this is very important and relevant. And DORA itself has been around for a little while. It's been, in design, in development and it started to become enforced in 2023. But people were given this kind of 2-year timeline to actually become compliant. And we'll go through the regulation itself shortly and what people need to be aligned to. But you were given a cutoff date, and that date is January the 17th, 2025. And that's kind of why we're talking about it now. People have been working towards DORA, and between Edward and myself, we want to make sure that you're ready to go for that January 17th deadline in 2025. So we're talking about it today. We're making sure you've ticked all those boxes, and we want to make sure you're ready for when it kicks in. And we'll talk about what actually happens when it kicks in later in the year, later in this session as well. So.
Awesome. Right, so let's then briefly move into the actual scope of this particular regulation. I think one of the first steps you as a business should take is probably assess yourself whether you are in or out of scope of this regulation. Because if you are in, there is effort to be considered that needs to be put in place in order to deliver compliance against this new legislation. So who is involved? The list is quite extensive. And amongst these entries within the list, there are also exclusions. During this particular presentation, it probably would not be very useful for us, or we wouldn't have enough time in order to cover specific cases. As such, businesses are most certainly advised to take the regulation and assess themselves against whether or not they are in scope or not. But by looking at the entries that are currently presented on this slide, if you feel like your business fits into any of these categories, it should give you an indication that you should potentially consult the regulation, the documentation provided to see whether or not you're in or out of this scope, because that will then place you whether you should be exerting any of the resources into compliance with it or not. What do you think, Dale? Looking at this particular
Make a good
list.
point. Yeah, it's a very extensive list. What I would say is while you're on this call with us, or if you want to do the research afterwards, there's a very exciting website you can go and view, which is https digital-operational-resiliency-act.com, and that's where you'll find the actual single source of truth for the regulation. Click on the full text articles link and you'll see these details that we're going through. So if you want to know where those exclusions are or whether you are included, that's where you go, read this article 2, and it will talk about everyone that it's relevant to and how it applies. And then if you're still unsure, that's where speaking to the right people, speak to your legal team, make sure they can kind of analyze it properly. Because between Edward and I, we're looking at it from a technology point of view and a cybersecurity point of view, not fully from the legal side of things as well. So definitely consult other people for this in your business.
Yeah, it's all about those definitions, right, Dale?
Definitely.
All right. So, okay, then moving next into the actual structure of the document. How does it look like? What does it cover? And what is the distribution of effort per each chapter stated within the document? All right. So after you have assessed yourself with respect to whether you are in or out of scope, and if your business is already doing something related to cybersecurity in terms of achieving levels of protection based on some standards such as NIST or ISO or some others, one of the things that you perhaps should be doing after assessing whether you're in or out of scope is effectively mapping yourself against the standard and this particular regulation as to what are the gaps, if there are any gaps, and where you should place your effort. Looking at this particular slide, it gives you a high-level overview of the document itself, right? The document is broken down into chapters, and chapters are broken down into articles, which effectively cover the requirements for each individual category specified in the document. Here in the last column, you will see the percentage sign as well. So looking at the actual requirements, how does the effort distribute in terms of the percentage value? So if I was to look at this table, I would go and say that ICT risk management accounts for 25% of all stated requirements in this particular regulation. And then if you look at ICT third-party risk management, it accounts for 40%. However, there's a caveat here as well that needs to be perhaps mentioned, and that is that this regulation doesn't necessarily only cover the requirements for individual businesses. It also covers requirements or expectations placed on the member states to install those new regulators within their states. Dale, what do you think of this structure? Like, in terms of the distribution of effort, like, what's your thoughts on the overall structure of the regulation?
Yeah, I think the structure is quite an interesting one. The key thing that they all outline is the information and due diligence that you need to put in place to understand these factors. From a technology point of view, we heavily focus on chapters 2 to 6, or sort of 2 to 5 is really what you need technology for. Chapter 6 is some additional processes you need to put in place around that. And then those extra 3 chapters towards the end, 7, 8, and 9, are much more about like how the process works of your checking and your paying fines and who's going to kind of provide this. So for any technology people thinking about their infrastructure, it's very much that chapter 2 to chapter 6 you want to start thinking about, which is what we're going to talk about shortly.
Yeah.
And it's about making sure you have that awareness of risk across your business, being able to track that and report on that accurately. And also now, which we'll talk about in more detail shortly, how you include third-party risk into that analysis. So as we move through the chapters, we'll go into those in a little bit of detail.
Right, so let's then look at the focus points effectively, or the key themes that you should focus your attention on as a business. It's, as Dale has suggested, there are effectively 5 key themes within this regulation, and those are the risk management, related incident management, classification and reporting, digital operational resilience testing, third-party risk management, and information sharing agreements. In terms of our businesses and what kind of businesses you can entertain in order to get some of the coverage with respect to the compliance, all these pieces here are interlinked. right? You can't be doing digital operational resilience testing without addressing risk management requirements because they're just simply interlinked. And this regulation is actually quite prescriptive in terms of what you could do in order to enable, for instance, third-party risk management. It gives you specific details what should be included in your contracts when you're assessing your supply chain requirements, for instance, what kind of provisions you should have in terms of your risk management framework. How should you go about classification and categorization of your incident management? And what kind of requirements you should have in place when you conduct your annual or quarterly cybersecurity pen tests or red team operations? Dale, what do you have to say about the key themes? Where does the business such as XM Cyber, for instance, could contribute to potentially help us out achieving this particular regulation and the
Yeah,
compliance
so
with it?
we like to think we can kind of help out and support many of these pillars, and we have different strengths in sort of different areas. So one of the pieces of content you'll be provided after this webinar is a sort of white paper that we've created that talks about the regulation in a bit more detail and outlines some of the steps you can go through to help ensure that you understand this. As we showed on the previous slide, there's a lot of articles, a lot of reading, a lot of elements in it. We've tried to make like a simpler version that just sort of shows you the logical steps you need to go on. So talking about risk management first, it's about defining what your risk is. So firstly, you've got to know where your assets are. Like, what are your critical assets? What do you define as a critical system, as a critical service to deliver your digital operations? And have you categorized them into kind of grouping? So it's about that awareness first that you need to understand those. Then you want to do that gap analysis. You want to make sure that you've documented those findings and that you understand what the risk is posed to each of those individual systems. And this regulation also talks about setting a risk tolerancy level, like understanding where you're willing to accept risk across those different environments and how much risk you're willing to take. And then as it wraps into other parts of the policy, it also talks about like how you monitor that those environments stay in that tolerancy. And I think these are areas where XM Cyber can add some really important value. You know, the analysis we do about your digital attack surface, the understanding of exposures and how they chain together. We also identify where your critical assets are and which ones are most at risk. And that helps you understand and set your tolerancy and know how to monitor and report on that and ensure that you've understood the threats that could be implementing them. But that risk is also, you know, it overlays things that aren't just cybersecurity. It also includes a lot of articles on backup, recovery, business continuity, making sure you have the processes in place to recover from an incident or recover from any kind of downtime as well. So you need to make sure you have those policies and processes in place as well. It's not all about technology. It is about the people and process that operate that. And I think all of these regulations, like in every one of these 5 pillars, it talks about establish a cadence of learning and evolution, or to harmonize those services. So you want to make those things better as you move through. So that's our focus on risk management. Is there anything you wanted to say on risk before I talk about incident and management as well?
No, I think you covered it quite well. But yeah, the key theme looking at the regulation is in effect risk management. If you look at the set of requirements covered, I think more than half of the requirements within the regulation actually specifically go after risk management, and everything else feeds into it in order to help businesses effectively manage their risk adequately and appropriately. So risk management is most certainly the key here. When it comes to third-party risk management as well, supply chains continue to grow, businesses continue to evolve, they continue to adopt new technologies, they continue to establish new relationships and partnerships, establishing new vendors and suppliers as part of their delivery. As such, third-party risk management is certainly a big piece in this particular equation. So what would you like to talk about, perhaps the incident management and classification and digital operational resilience testing? Because I think SAM Cyber covers quite a lot in this particular space.
Yeah, it definitely does. It kind of covers over into that. So we talked about like that data we provide for risk, but we also provide that data in a way that helps you adapt to incidents and respond to those threats that are tackling your business. So for incident management, The regulation is talking about like establishing the right processes and procedures around that, and also being able to classify different types of incidents. So what counts as a minor incident, what counts as a major incident, and which ones need to be reported and how they need to be reported to different member states in the regulation. It then also talks about having awareness of cyber threats. So the ones that haven't quite happened yet. Like an incident is something where the threat is real, the risk has come to life in a threat and it's actually taken your business down or caused you an issue. The cyber threats is the reality of like what a risk is and then what the threat is against that particular risk. So having that correlated information of where your risks lie, what are the particular threats, what are the attack techniques and the ways that an attacker could exploit your environment, and having that classification and being able to discover and analyze that on a continuous basis. So it's all part of that investigation of incidents, but also threat hunting in a single platform. So it's being able to take that risk, correlate it to incidents, and then ultimately test that information. So the
Yes.
digital operation resiliency testing has around 13 different tests it expects you to run, from external attack surface, vulnerability management, software testing, ensuring you've got the right code in place and those procedures around it. Through XM Cyber, we can't fix everything for you. We can't cover every level of test. I'm sure in Adarma's portfolio, they have a broader set of tools that can support you on that operational resiliency testing. From my point of view, external attack surface is important, exposed credentials. We do vulnerability assessments to find out where those weaknesses are. And there's this new requirement in DORA that talks about threat-led penetration testing. So the threat-led penetration testing is something you're supposed to have a third party come and deliver against your environment on a sort of 3-year basis. And XM Cyber is going to help you with that approach. So we do, we use threat scenarios to model attacks against your environment as part of breach attack simulation and some automated pen testing. So being able to do that in a methodology that's aligned to what the regulators will need you to align to, we can help you with that readiness. So it's about a tool to give you that awareness to understand how a threat-led penetration test might work, so you can run it continuously in your environment, so that day, that week, that month before the audit, you're not losing any sleep. You know that you're going to withstand your threat-led penetration test because you've done enough testing and readiness with the right tools in place. One thing I will point out, though, is the testing requires it across all attack surfaces. So digital attack surface, human attack surface, and the physical attack surface. So obviously we're going to help you with the digital side of the things and understand where your services and attack surface is weak. I can't necessarily help you with your human attack surface or some of the physical, but there are certain processes and services Adarma would offer to help you understand and test those two attack surfaces as well, to make sure it's a complete picture of resiliency testing that you have.
Yeah, but this is excellent, Dale. Thank you very much for covering this. I guess, where do we come into this equation? Because there's the attacker's perspective, where you go into the environment and you model the threats and you perform the hunts and then you inform a test against an environment. We come from the defender's perspective. We are the alarm system for your business. We use threat intelligence in order to inform the defenses, so that when companies come in to test your defenses utilizing this threat intelligence, you are covered from a defense perspective. So the alarm system is ringing, the incidents are being addressed, and automated responses are in place in order to effectively manage impact on your organization. This is what managed security operations and services are all about, and this is what we deliver as a business. All right. So moving into the next slide then. So what can you expect from the new regulators? What will they be able to do? Because each member state will have their own. However, they all have to implement this piece of legislation. So you will be able to expect from your new regulators the ability to request any form of data that they consider to be useful to their investigations and day-to-day operations when they want to go and investigate your business in case if they suspect a breach. They will be able to conduct inspections and any form of investigation that they deem necessary in order to accomplish a full view into the business with respect to the suspected breach. They'll be able to impose administrative penalties. And what's very important to note, they will also be able, in some cases, pursue a prosecution. So we are now talking about potential criminal charges. As such, if you are sitting somewhere in a leadership role, and if you're one of the directors within the business who is supposed to be dealing with information security within your business, this is something that you should be aware about. So how about Dale, like, what's your opinion about this new regulator? Perhaps from your experience, have you seen other regulators to impose these type of powers onto the businesses, or is it something new?
I think it's a combination of both. There's a new angle on this for DORA. So in one of the last pillars we talked about, or we were going to, on that shown on that last slide, is about information sharing arrangements, and it actually asks you to foster a culture of collaboration. And one of the people who wants you to include is these regulators and authorities. So it's about, cybersecurity has always been about keeping everything to yourself. Attackers do a great job of sharing information. They share the best ways to attack someone. They share information about where people are weak. But organizations are always left on their own to defend against, those attacks and try and keep their data to themselves. This regulation with information sharing talks about actually trying to be a bit more open and having some like set up some peering groups, set up an open line of communication with the authorities and the regulator to actually understand and share information about how they should work with you and how you should work with them and how you should keep your systems up to date. So there's actually this new kind of viewpoint of not just keeping the regulator at arm's length and waiting for them to impose rules and restrictions against you, but actually kind of inviting them in, sharing information with them up front, understanding how that they are taking that information and helping you support and improve your systems as well. So there's this nice new sort of tangent, I think, which is going to open up and allow people to kind of work with their peer groups, work with industry experts and consultancy services, work with the authorities and regulators to make sure that they're being armed with the right information and sharing what they discover and being able to have that kind of culture of what I consider a collective defense, like working together with the tools and the information and the people that can help you be more secure. So I actually see the regulators having another role that's maybe not called out here to actually support that environment as well. So I'm kind of hopeful that DORA is going to have this different relationship between a business and their regulators to make sure that they're both working in harmony to be successful in this regulation.
This is actually an excellent point, yeah, and it is one of the key pillars within the actual regulation. It is the information sharing bit. So, as you pointed out, attackers are very good at sharing the intelligence about their potential targets, and I think so far it has been a bit of a, I guess, the discussions about the threat profiles of individual businesses were kind of kept to themselves. People are not very keen to actually go and talk about the potential vulnerabilities they have in their states. So having a platform where businesses can come together under a single regulator to share intelligence with respect to a particular sector, such as financial sector, I think this will most certainly benefit the entire sector. And again, it's that information dissemination and ability to utilize this information effectively that will really make a difference.
Yeah.
Right. So, and now finally, let's talk about what does non-compliance actually look like, right? So we have DORA regulation. It is coming into effect in the coming year, January time. So what to expect if you found yourself being non-compliant with this particular piece of legislation? So we know that member states will be able to impose administrative penalties, and we know that member states will also be able to potentially prosecute businesses for not complying with this bit of legislation. Despite all the noise online, however, the regulation itself doesn't necessarily stipulate the figures to indicate what will be the potential limits of the administrative penalties. There is indication with respect to critical ICT technology service providers, which states that the regulator, the lead overseers that will be appointed by the European Commission and other bodies, they will be able to impose penalties if they find critical ICT technology service providers non-compliant, and they will be able to charge up to 1% of annual turnover per day. But and this is something they will be able to do for 6 months. However, the regulation doesn't state who are the currently identified critical ICT service providers, and this is something that will be released at some point in time. In terms of the administrative penalties, member states are there to decide as to what is appropriate. And if, for instance, they do decide to pursue criminal charges instead, again, this will vary depending on the member state. So it is important to assess your business and keep a lookout for the member states and what legislation, how they will adopt this legislation with respect to administrative penalties and potential criminal charges. All right. Dale, do you have anything else you'd like to add with respect to non-compliance? Any sort of
Yeah.
thoughts, maybe?
Well, I want everyone to be compliant, so we should be safe and no penalties, obviously. But the two factors that kind of contribute to this from the earlier pillars that you can read through is when you are classifying or when you're understanding and having awareness of those minor and major incidents. One of the kind of criteria for that is to make sure that you understand which member states were affected. So there's a big spread of things that you need to know about your sort of incidents or how you kind of manage them, around the amount of downtime, what services were affected, what users were affected, and it's what member states were affected. What was the geographical spread of that incident or downtime? So that's going to be a key factor in understanding which of the member states you then need to potentially pay a penalty to or align to their particular requirements. So as part of your preparedness or readiness for that pillar 2, chapter 3, which is the incident management and classification, is having that awareness of that geographical spread and impact to member states. And the other thing that Edward mentioned as well is about third parties who provide critical ICT systems. So as part of that third party analysis, you need to understand of your providers who is providing a third party service for standard digital systems and who is providing a service for your critical systems.
Yeah.
And it's that classification that you've done. So as part of that sort of readiness assessment, where you've understood third parties either sit in one bucket and have a certain amount of regulatory requirement, and other providers that you utilize may sit in a bigger bucket which have more of those articles and regulations and requirements, and they count as those critical ICT providers, which then get incorporated and wrapped into these penalties and these tracking and remedial measures, as Edward was talking about a moment ago.
Yeah. It's precisely to your point. So no business is the same in terms of, and as such, when the regulators will be considering potentially administrative penalties, there is a number of factors that will need to be in play. And we already seen similar examples with the General Data Protection Act, for instance. One of the things that the regulators will most certainly look at is the materiality or perhaps the duration of the breach that has commenced, and what is the involvement of the financial entity in this breach. If, for instance, the financial entity has enabled it to happen due to negligence of some form, then it's significantly a bigger problem. However, if it's a black swan type of event where nothing could have been done, this is a 0-day vector, then it's a different story, right? What will matter as well is how a business responds to the incident, how it engages with the regulator, and whether or not it is being supportive of the regulator in the investigation. So it's something to consider. You do really want to have a good relationship with the regulator in the member state where you operate as a business, right? And then another thing is obviously the financial strength of the organization. The regulator is not going to go out of its way in order to penalize you and put some insane financial penalties upon your business. They will consider the strength of the organization, and they will need to apply proportionality to the matter. So it's not going to be something that they will be able to just impose out of the blue. And of course, there is also this whole back and forward conversation with the regulator where you will be able to appeal potential administrative penalties and decisions that are promoted by the regulator themselves. So something to consider. And with that in mind, perhaps we can move into the Q&A. We would be happy to answer any of your questions.
Yeah, so we've just got that one. If you can see the Q&A panel, there's one sort of more a sort of statement than a question, but talks about the scope of organisations that are in scope versus the organisations that will be the addressee, an addressee of the law, and just sort of again, just to reiterate, technical people, we're talking about the cyber security element of this, not the full kind of legal ramifications. So, consult your legal departments as well for kind of further advice in this particular space. So we've got another question just coming in here. I'm watching these kind of come through.
So what would you suggest is a good first step to reach DORA compliance? Dale, how would you comment on that?
Well, the first is kind of attend this webinar. The second is kind of download our white paper. There's also blog articles. I've written some blog articles. Ed has written some as well that take you to kind of other pieces of content. But start with that understanding of risk, a comprehensive understanding. So if I was talking about the steps as a summary, it's about establishing a comprehensive ICT risk management framework that doesn't just talk about the likelihood of risk, it talks about the impact of risk, and it also needs to cover that digital operational risk, like understanding what could take down your systems or services. You want to optimize what you're delivering, so have that understanding, know what your environment is, know how it functions, understand how you can document and record that. As you move to the next step, you start to look at your incident management, and you're going to need to integrate all parts of that puzzle. So it's not just about the technology, it's about the people and the process as well, to understand how you should move through that environment. What are the processes, and is everybody trained? Does everybody know what the incident management process is? Does everybody know how to track that information? And does everybody know what the DORA regulation is? Do they know why they're providing this contextual information? Make sure you have awareness across the business to deliver that. The next thing you need to do then, once you have all that information, is actually do testing on that environment. Make sure you test those different systems to establish that risk and make sure it stays within its tolerancy. But make sure you also test that incident management process as well. Make sure you know how to recover from incidents, make sure you conduct those kind of regularly, and make sure you include third-party service providers in that system as well. So anyone that's providing you any information, communication and technology systems to make your digital services run, you need to make sure they're included in both that incident management and that risk analysis as well. And that final step, keep informed, make sure you know what that regulation is, make sure you reach out to your peer groups, collaborate, and so really foster that culture of collaboration with advisory houses, consultancy services, partners, vendors, authorities, regulators. Just bring that together and make sure you kind of have all the information you need and have that awareness to drive towards that collective defense to make sure you can all successfully implement DORA together. Now,
excellent advice.
I guess I'll throw that question back to you. So, we've got we'll put some details on the screen in a minute of where they can reach out. But what's that step to engage with Adarma and sort of talk about how Adarma can help customers on their journey to DORA adoption?
Yeah, I think perhaps a little bit about the steps that we would advise, just to complement what you have said already. So as we have gone through the slide deck, the first thing that we would advise is to perhaps start with identifying whether or not you're in or out of the scope of this particular regulation. Because if you are, then you have to go and assess the resource requirements, what's the gap effectively within the business in order to help you drive those decisions and resource allocations to get yourself into compliance. However, if you're out of the scope, well, fantastic. You just don't have to go and implement those 200 requirements that are stated in the document. So when you identify that you are in scope of this particular regulation, the next level or the next step would be to establish what is the current level of your compliance. If you already are adopting standards such as NIST or ISO, chances are that you are not starting from zero. So you are somewhere halfway through that journey, but you need to establish what is the gap. And this is a quite significant time and resource allocation, because to go through over 200 requirements and map yourself as to where you stand with this particular regulation will take some time and effort. When you have finally formed an opinion on the gap, the next step after that would be to potentially actually go and set up a roadmap as to how you're going to tackle the gap and what you need to put in place in order to address it. You need to prioritize the resource allocations in order to be effective and efficient. And as it has been stated, it is important to go about, for instance, how would you deal with business continuity and disaster recovery? Do you have appropriate plans in place and processes and procedures? Are people informed? Are you conducting any sort of an incident response or crisis simulation? Are you doing anything with respect to testing, as Dale has stated? Is this testing threat-led? Is it informed by the current threat intelligence that is available to the sector? This type of stuff needs to be taken into consideration in order to make sure that you're effective and efficient with your available resources. And again, it depends on the available expertise that you may have in-house. And if you do not have appropriate people or they are not available because everyone's busy, then what other options are available to you in that moment in time, especially given the current timeline as to when DORA will come into full effect. So when you have constructed that roadmap, it's a matter of actually putting the resources in place and executing that roadmap. And this is where effectively you can potentially utilize either your internal members of staff or maybe consult with additional service providers in order to get you up to speed with this legal requirement. Perhaps another bit to the question was where we could potentially get further guidance and information. And I guess if there's no other questions, we can maybe move to the other slide. Or
One question has just come in as well around, how would you sum up the expectations placed on a third-party ICT provider for a regulated entity? So that would be, it is one of the categories in scope of the entities that not only does the financial entity need to have awareness of their third-party providers, but the people that offer those third-party services need to meet this regulation or certain requirements of this regulation as well, depending on whether it's dependent on whether they're providing just ICT services or what's deemed as ICT critical services. So it's part of working with that financial entity, having that open information sharing arrangement, understanding if the service you deliver is deemed as critical to their delivery of a digital financial service, then it would be in scope, and you would need to map that same level of information and awareness to be able to provide it to the financial entity as part of their regulatory requirement. So there's definitely, we'll do a sort of follow up and dig into that in more detail for the person who asked that question.
Yeah, it's actually very important because it is aimed at ICT service providers to some extent, right? And I think one of the steps that ICT service providers can actually do is go into the ICT third-party risk management pillar and look at what requirements are placed on the financial entities with respect to their supply chain management. It will provide you with information as to what you would need to share to give that comfort and confidence to your potential partners within the financial sector that you are resilient as a service provider. They will be able to then gain the necessary confidence in you as a service provider to entertain business opportunities. The actual pillar does have a prescription as to what information you would need to share and what financial entities would seek from you in order to inform these business decisions.
Cool.
All right.
Now we can go on to the next steps.
All right. So in terms of perhaps where you could get additional information, additional help. So Dale.
Yeah, so you've got the official website you can go to as well, the digital operational resiliency act, and that's where you'll find the full articles. You can then visit any of the content we published on the XM Cyber website. You can start your journey. We've got a lightweight blog. We've got a short checklist, which then takes you to other content such as this white paper. But this will also be sent to you along with the Adarma kind of content after this event. If you do have a question specifically for me about where XM Cyber can offer value, we have an email address that's not shown here. I forgot to add it. It's DORA@xmcyber.com. And then you will be able to sort of get your questions answered about DORA, or you can fire your questions over to Edward at the Adarma team here via the address shown now.
Another useful piece of information to be shared with the group is that the European Union does actually put together its own standards. And one of the requirements that has been placed on some of the governing bodies within the European Union was to actually put some technical standards to help member states and businesses that fall in scope of this regulation achieve the legislation. So we will be able to provide this information. So please do reach out. In fact, let me go and post a link just now into the chat that you can familiarize yourself with these technical standards. But this is something to complement effectively anything that you already do with respect to NIST and ISO standards. But this is effectively the source, the actual cookbook or the prescription from the European Union as to what you need to do in order to ensure that you follow the requirements within the legislation. All right. And if there's no any other questions, I guess we can move into the last slide. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending our webinar today on DORA. I hope this has been useful. Thank you, Dale, for participating on this webinar and contributing and giving that perspective from effectively the attacker's perspective on how to go about DORA and what it means. And yeah, thank you, everyone else.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the session. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
All right. Oh, Amy? There's a hand raised, I believe.